Hey, welcome to Pacific Northwest Geography. This is our first YouTube, and I'm hoping that it will help you understand the notes better. The notes are designed for to be accompanied by YouTube videos. In the in-person version of this class, of course, I would just say what I'm about ready to say to you, but in class. But in some ways, you've got an advantage because you can now repeat it back and listen to it again if you need to. Whereas in the class, that wasn't so easy. So it isn't all bad, this online education, huh? I think most of us would rather do it in person, but hey, we are doing what we can do given the circumstances. What I want to show you is a bit about the geologic history of the region. Proper treatment of that would take a whole term, and we have really less than a week. So we're just going to hit some of the high spots, talk a little bit here and there about evidence for some of the things we're talking about. But if you're a person who likes to see evidence, as I am, and you're curious as well about the topic, you might want to take a class from our Earth Science program where they actually do a whole course on this topic, and they'll give lots of evidence there. Ours is a little lighter dose of evidence because we don't have the time to do it. So where is this? Let's go ahead and go into slideshow mode. And by the way, I recommend that you print these out if you can, each slide, because they are your study notes. But my accompanying remarks hopefully will help along the way. So let's go ahead and look at this full size there. Where is this? You look at it, and some of you probably can see that some of the trees in the back there are pine trees. It's not really a real wet looking forest. You can kind of see on the hillside back here. So guess what? This is a place that was the Pacific Northwest a long, long time ago, still is today. And you want to jot down in your notes, this slide is the Clark Fork River, western Montana. And virtually its entire length in western Montana, I think without any exceptions, it has Interstate 90 alongside or very nearby. So if you go back in geologic time to 800 million years ago, that's what our region really was like for a big spell of time. The western border of Idaho is coastline. All areas to the west were open ocean. Inland areas were deserts. Yes, there was no Washington and Oregon as we know them today. This survived again up to about 200 million years ago, and that's where it gets interesting. So that's really where we're going to pick up the story. During the last 200 million years, and by the way, this is the North Cascades, the northern Rocky Mountains rose along the western margin of the continent, and areas east of the Rockies were desert and then became inland shallow sea. Okay. This area, we can look at this in our geohistory slide. So I'm going to escape out. I'm going to grab that. I already have those open here up above to the left. You might want to stop and get those out. And maybe if you have another device, look at them there. And it might be good to print those out as well just to accompany us, but I'm going to show you some of the highlights here. So let's have a look. If we go to this, to the almost the very beginning, we have, as it says there, new mountains along an old coast. So the old coast was Idaho, okay, and in the central part of the Pacific Northwest, at least going north into British Columbia and going south, Utah. So the early mountains, this is how they looked, where you would have, this is the beginning of the Rockies eventually, okay? But the Pacific plate is pushing underneath and it's thrusting this material here, thickening the continent, and that is a mountain building process eventually. And what this looks like then is the Rockies here, and we can extend up north into British Columbia and south a little bit too, the way I like to think of the Northwest. And we have this dry region to the east. That was the Pacific Northwest. Wow. So there's kind of a rain shadow or a dry side here, and then some early mountains forming in this area. Okay. And so then, what we're going to do is skip forward, and we're going to come back to this later, but I'm going to go to slides 143, where this was a shallow inland sea that eventually forms. And let's just read a little bit about that. The northern Rocky Mountains are still rising and spreading to the west. And the inland sea flooded west over much of Wyoming and Montana. And black shale accumulated offshore to the east, and peat that would become thin coal seams accumulated in coastal swamps. Yes, so that's a kind of a sneak preview. Yes, we have fossil fuels, coal in particular, but also oil and natural gas are part of what this was all created in this environment of the inland sea. Okay, and we don't really have a history of that on the other side during the right time for that to work. So this is eventually the sea does begin to retreat here. This is page 145. It shows that rapid eastward retreat of the sea. And it was not a deep sea. It describes banks of oysters that left behind solid masses of oyster shells. You can still see those today. So we know it was an inland sea for a lot of reasons, and that's just a real simple kind of piece of evidence of that. Okay, and then finally, here's the other piece of evidence that was an inland sea. This is classic sedimentary geology, and this is what seas do over time, one layer on top of another. And so this is older here, and then it gets younger as you go up. And then later an erosional event would expose all of this, but this is sedimentary rocks. Okay, so that's just a quick look, and those coal beds we talked about, here they are. Okay, so now going back into our notes here. That's the economic resource we're talking about, those coal beds. And also natural gas and oil, and broadly speaking, in that region of the shallow sea were formed. The beginnings of that were happening at this time period. Large and small scraps of coastal rocks attached themselves to the west coastline, assembling the geologic mosaic of the Pacific Northwest. Yeah, let me say that again. Large and small scraps of coastal rocks attached themselves to the west coast. Yeah, wow. So the key features, the big kind of stories here where the large mountains still existing today were part of this, where the Klamath, Blue, and Wallowa Mountains and others were groups of islands or terrains far out in the Pacific that lodged against the western edge of the North American continent. At the same time, other terrains, as they're called, groups of islands, jammed against the western edge of the continent, forming much of the North Cascades and one large mass that became Vancouver Island and the west coast of BC. So again, I'm going to skate back to our geohistory a little bit here and look at some of that. This is what we're talking about here, where you have this subduction, and then you have what's called a microcontinent. Sometimes there's volcanic arcs, there can be small continents and so on, but they push up against the continent they lodge there. So this is the process. You have one lodge there, and you got another coming, it's going to lodge on there, that sort of thing. That's what we're talking about there. And also I want to look at Lilly. Has some good stuff on this, Lillie. That's the first one, the pages 1 through 13. You can see that's page 4, and basically in the kind of general model of converging plate boundaries, you have this happening, right? And then this is where you get the volcanic activity, right? So that is, if you haven't seen that concept before, that's why we're looking at this here, and Lilly does a nice job of describing that. It's actually a manual. Lilly is actually a manual that they sell in national parks for people, for tourists. It's not like super technical science, but it's just enough, I think, to get us to some level of understanding in this class. And that's really all I'm attempting to do here. And so in the broader context, what we can see here is that the Pacific Northwest is part of this larger region here of the Pacific Rim. And this is a zone of volcanic activity, earthquakes, all around it. And so that's one of the reasons we have tsunami risks in the region. Okay. And this coating here is a hot spot. Yellowstone is a hot spot. We'll get to that later on. And so the setting a kind of map scale of this is that subduction zone is here. We've got the volcanic axis all along here. Some older and more recent periods of volcanic activity forming in the area. So this is the Pacific Northwest as we know it, and modern day. All right. So here we are. Let's go. We've now seen how these mountain systems can lodge against basically they're just accreted or docked, sometimes they use the term, or jammed. The geologists love to use these different terms, but basically it's just this material on this conveyor belt that packs up against the coastline. And it even includes large parts of the North Cascades. Some of it is volcanic, but most of it is not. And one large mass that became Vancouver Island and the west coast of British Columbia. And that is the geohistory 82, especially 106. So let's look at that real quickly. We saw, I guess we did see that already, yeah. And then this is the one I wanted to show you, though. This one shows more detail and more information. So this says Blue Mountains here, if you can't read that. The Wallowa is part of that same complex. The North Cascades lodged on here. There's an intermountain terrain that happened first, right? So this stuff lodged on first, right? And then later, and then later, and then later. So we even have Vancouver Island docking on the edge of the continent. And a lot of this inside was carved with glaciers, by the way, if you wondered. So these are newcomers. So in a sense, much of the Pacific Northwest is immigrants. In this case, it's immigration of large masses of mountains, volcanic islands, and so on, depending on which one we're talking about, that came from the ocean. So we're basically docking on material from somewhere else. And our region largely came, interestingly enough, from somewhere else. Oops, clicked on the wrong one there. Didn't need that. So I'm going to go back to our notes for just a second here. And I think we're getting almost due on time for this. Let me just move this up. So basically the west coast of BC and the North Cascades, all of that are part of that story. And I would recommend you look at this YouTube. I'm not going to show it to you here, but it does show that whole process. And there's also really great stuff at the Burke Museum based in the Seattle area that lays out some of this in detail too. Especially I put that for those of you who might teach this someday, okay? So that's where we're going to conclude for this first YouTube.